Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, November 28th edition of the Cluster API subgroup meeting for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Today, we're going to start with some questions from Locke about some changes to clusterctl. Locke, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so the first item is the ability to query for a list of cluster. I know that this doesn't isn't interesting for everybody, but for those of us who are using or implementing a management cluster style pattern, and we're using the management cluster to create mini clusters, the ability to list the cluster from clusterctl instead of forcing the user to go to kubectl after they use clusterctl to create would be, I think, a better user experience. And it wouldn't be that hard to add this. So I wanted to see if what people think about adding this functionality.
So I had a couple of questions. One was, have you thought about overlap with the cluster registry that the multi-cluster SIG is building?
I looked at the cluster registry a couple months back, but I wasn't sure exactly how they integrate with cluster API yet. The creation of cluster and is the cluster registry meant to be sort of like the Docker registry for clusters? Is that what the cluster registry is meant for?
I think that their intent is to be just sort of a list of clusters where you can build like a multi-cluster controller. Like I know they've built a controller called multi-cluster ingress, which allows you to create an ingress controller that targets services in more than one cluster. And that controller can look at the cluster registry to see which clusters should be targeted by the ingress. So I think that they see themselves as sort of filling that role of, if you have more than one cluster, let's put them all in one place so that we can build management tools on top of that. So I think the interesting question for me here is, if we are using this sort of management cluster pattern, then how does that overlap with what they're building? And does that management cluster become a natural place to also sort of run the cluster registry CRDs and maybe the controllers for that cluster registry for the clusters that it's managing?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, I need to take a look at it. I don't know enough about the cluster registry to comment.
So is the kind of suggestion right now basically just to provide kind of like an kind of more user-friendly way to run kubectl, get clusters, -- all namespaces?
Basically, yeah. Those of us who are developers, we understand that you can use kubectl to create for the list of cluster, but we work with a lot of administrators, and they have a different mindset, and it would just be a little bit of a mind shift for them. So just adding that simple feature would be very user friendly.
That would only work if clusterctl is talking to the management cluster, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, in Kopsland, we've had this idea which predates the cluster API called Kop server. And the idea is that we would have API objects like the cluster and the machine deployment. And that would be the first one. And then the second one would be that we'd basically move the controllers onto the server. So I guess in that world, we wouldn't really expect people to use the Kops CLI tool very much. And I guess the analog here would be, do you expect people to continue to use clusterctl in this world? Which is, I guess, what Robbie was saying, right?
So I know that some of you guys have expressed that you guys view clusterctl as a bridge tool, but for us, we're still using clusterctl. And until we have a solution, until we decide to do something different, clusterctl is our intermediate tool also. So we would like to expand the functionality of it until we decide to switch. Does that answer you?
It does. I think from the point of view of clusterctl as a bridge tool, like, does it really matter if we put in some extra functionality into it? Probably not, right? So that would support this idea to make it better. I would say that I think that the COPS vision was that you would use kubectl or other like native tooling, right? So like if you don't like kubectl, you know, use dashboard, whatever it is, but like get people using the same the raw Kubernetes API, the kubectl tooling, and push them in that direction so that they don't have this sort of jump from clusterctl to kubectl, but it's all, you know, it's all the same thing, whether you're managing a cluster or managing application. But if it's a temporary thing, if we also see clusterctl as a temporary thing, I personally don't particularly object to putting in a list of clusters in there, but I think we should, I think the better approach in the management cluster thing that you're talking about, or the COP server world, is to get people using kubectl.
Yeah, I'm a little torn personally, because, you know, one, I think we should push people towards kubectl in a way, because we don't necessarily want them having to kind of force them through clusterctl for modifying clusters or creating new clusters with the management cluster, or even editing machines. But at the same time, if we are talking about kind of users that aren't overly familiar with Kubernetes, trying to get them to understand that you have to pass in all namespaces to get the full list of clusters, because we don't have, because that's how we're linking machines and clusters right now, is per namespace, rather than having a more explicit link between the two. So I can see some value to having it just for that simplification, for user kind of experience. But I don't necessarily think that we want to force all additional commands into clusterctl to accommodate all of the different types of workflows you would do with the clusters and the machine objects.
So Jason, in your from your standpoint, you see even creating clusters using kubectl?
Well, so it depends by what you mean by creating clusters. You know, if you're talking about creating the individual objects, you know, while the phases kind of support that, it's kind of a clunky workflow to go through to just kind of apply a YAML file to the API server, you know, versus like orchestration. So like one of the things we're looking at for the AWS provider right now is how do we implement kind of an HA workflow, because clusterctl doesn't support that natively. So we're going to go through and build the manual steps using the phases to do that. And then we were thinking about building kind of a CLI tool to automate that HA deployment workflow. And I see more kind of custom tooling like that coming into place, especially if you're dealing with like a cluster manager type of server. You could have a tool that would deploy the cluster manager, and maybe it, you know, you could customize the way that it, you know, handles a bootstrap cluster, you know, removing Minikube if you wanted to do that. But then you could also provide kind of friendlier tooling to, you know, actually do the cluster creation workflows where you're dealing with the multiple objects with the cluster and the machines. So like for the AWS provider, we could provide a much more scope limited config that allows you to modify just the AWS provider stuff. And it can automate kind of that deployment, and it would create kind of the more complex kind of cluster and machine objects that we have to interact with cluster API. So I see over time kind of more of that simplified tooling coming, wrapping kind of the more complex cluster API interfaces over time.
So you see like not CLI, but multiple binaries, like one that actually creates cluster, one that, you know, sets up HA clusters, or
potentially.
Okay.
You know, where it all shakes out, I think it'll be interesting to see. But like, you know, that kind of methodology would provide a way, if COPS eventually does adopt Cluster API, to migrate users using the existing kind of COPS config and interface onto that Cluster API kind of based implementation, and provide a much friendlier experience for those users to kind of migrate. And then I think we'll see kind of additional kind of simplifications for user experience that can crop up over time. And then eventually maybe we'll have some grand unified thing, but at the very least, we'll have a playground to kind of experiment with the different UXs.
Yeah, I guess the question I would step back and ask is whether clusterctl, do we expect that to become a cluster management tool that we want people to use instead of using kubectl? Or do we expect it to really sort of be this bootstrapping tool, like Justin was saying that he expected COPS to turn into over time with the COPS server, where it's something you run once to get started and then don't have to use again. So you wouldn't use it to upgrade clusters or maybe even list clusters, because once you have your bootstrap or your management cluster in place, you can just interact with that cluster to create child clusters using kubectl or sort of more specific tools for that purpose.
Okay. So for us, we don't need clusterctl to bootstrap. We have another mechanism. So the reason why, just I guess because we haven't had time to think about it, but we've still been using clusterctl because of all the steps in the workflow for creation that that we've been using it for, but we can replace it actually with just a shell script that does all the same thing. So maybe that's the way to do it.
So part of the work behind the phases work was to allow kind of some reusability of those steps as well. So that might be some potential to kind of share kind of the common workflow steps with clusterctl without having to kind of adopt it fully.
Okay.
I'd also say that I think kubectl has plugins now that actually are, I don't know if they're first class, but they certainly they aren't hidden under like a plugin subcommand anymore. So if you have that objection to kubectl, you can write a plugin now.
Oh, so you can modify kubectl to do.
You can add a word after kubectl.
Okay.
Like you could write kubectl namespace is the example I like to give.
Okay. I might look into that. Well, so the next question I had, well, it's very similar to that topic. The workflow for the clusterctl delete doesn't work for us. The part of the workflow that tries to delete the API objects and then it does the pivot. I don't know if anybody's using clusterctl delete cluster, but it just hangs for us. And I don't really see the need for deleting the API objects first, so on the target cluster. So can anybody tell me if they feel that there is a need to do that?
So I can explain to you why that was implemented that way, because I was talking to Rob about this when he was trying to figure out how to implement delete. And the thing he was concerned about was if you have two clusters that both at the same time have a representation of the resources in that cluster, the machines of the cluster itself, then it's unclear who is managing the cluster and they can fight over that cluster. And so the idea was what you'd do is you'd remove things from the target cluster so that the controllers in that cluster would stop managing things. And then so you'd copy them out, you'd remove them from that cluster, and then you'd start the controllers in sort of the external cluster. I guess it's not a bootstrap cluster because it's for teardown, but in that bootstrap cluster, and then it would sort of take over managing those resources, and that allows you to delete them without the controllers inside the cluster fighting with you. And so that's why they are removed from that cluster, is so that the controllers in that cluster stop managing them.
Okay, that's a good explanation. I guess we'll look into a little bit more why it's maybe it's our provider that's having a problem.
So it might be related to the way that it's calling out to delete the objects right now, because it may be hanging on the delete right now when it's trying to delete those objects because of the finalizers.
That's where we're seeing it. We were seeing the list of finalizer getting appended multiple over and over again, and
Yeah, I saw a couple of issues with kind of the pivot workflow, and there's a discrepancy between the way that we're pivoting when we're going to the target cluster versus from the target cluster. And I was hoping to actually start looking into that more deeply and kind of genericize the pivot workflow this week. So I'll probably reach out to double check with those issues that you're seeing to make sure that I'm addressing those as well.
Okay.
And that being said, I think the way we sketched out delete was sort of very specific to you're pivoting out into this bootstrapping cluster. We spent a lot of time talking about alternatives for creation, where you maybe don't have a bootstrapping ephemeral cluster, you have this sort of more long-standing management cluster. And so we may need to, in the same way we've rethought creation and Jason's broken it into phases, maybe we need to look at delete more closely and figure out a better way to factor it so that it works in both of those scenarios. So I don't know, like I said, I've never tested it in the scenario you're describing. I have tested it in the pivoted out scenario, and we've made sure it worked in that scenario. Right? So it's possible it just doesn't work correctly in your scenario today, and we need to fix that.
Yeah, I'll spend some time looking at it too.
Okay, so Locke, you had those two questions, and then Jason threw another question under this same heading about HA, which he started touching on, but maybe we should dive into that a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, so right now, clusterctl kind of automatically assumes just a single control plane instance. I wanted to see if we wanted to start having a discussion about how do we handle HA control planes. Is that something that we do want to kind of codify into clusterctl as kind of like a short-term stopgap, or do we want to look at something more kind of radical, like we've discussed in the past, for actually having like the cluster object manage the control plane instances or some other thing like that? Because right now, kind of the way that we're looking at doing it for the AWS provider is basically serially create the control plane instances, where we create the initial one using kubeadm and init, and then we serially create the additional control plane instances using the new control plane join, experimental control plane join feature in kubeadm 113. And there's potential around lock contention or race conditions around how we access some of the objects in kubeadm right now that's forcing us to do it serially. But over time, we should be able to kind of parallelize that more. But I just want to see people's thoughts on whether it would make sense to kind of extend the current clusterctl workflow to support it, or if we wanted to kind of abandon that to kind of go a more holistic approach about how do we actually stand up a cluster and the control plane.
I'm happy always to share like how Kops has done it, but I would love to hear any cool ideas before we, like, kubeadm has a way to do it, Kops has a way to do it. I don't think the Kops one is perfect, and if anyone has a great idea, I would love to discuss that before we, focus on any particular approaches. But yeah, you were hinting that there might be a better way, Jason.
Well, I just know in the past we had talked about kind of making the cluster actuator actually spin out either the control plane instances or manage the control plane in some other way, versus the way that we're doing it now. We're having these predefined machine objects for the control plane that we're hard coding the workflow for standing those up as part of clusterctl.
I haven't quite figured out how to do this, but I would love for us not to have this distinction between machines that run a startup script to be a control plane and machines that run a startup script to be a node, and have every machine effectively just be a node, and then be able to then sort of schedule or after the fact run the control plane bits on top of them. And I think in like Locke's scenario with the management cluster, that's possible because you have something else that can control things out of band. I'm not sure how we do that if we don't have a management cluster, and so that's why we still have the init scripts today. But that was part of the reason to like push the master role node out of the API, because I know like folks like VMware and SAP are using this management cluster where that field makes no sense. And I think the API is much cleaner if we can assume every machine is just a node that can run things, right? Because it has a kubelet. I just haven't wrapped my brain around exactly how we make that work in practice, right? Because at some point you do have to run this kubeadmin init or kubeadmin control plane join, and something has to trigger that, right? And so maybe there's a way for the bootstrap cluster to like run a job or run like something as like a one-shot thing to get that like if you could schedule a pod that basically is running privileged mode and like drops into the local OS and runs kubeadmin init and can drop the files on there, and like maybe that's a way to bootstrap it, or maybe there's another way to do that if you don't have this other cluster that's sort of able to manage it for you.
Maybe this is a good topic to kind of try to tackle, putting together some proposals around for KubeCon.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and hopefully a number of people on the call will be at KubeCon where we can, and Tim points out in chat we need a KEP, but I think even before a KEP, I think it'd be useful to like sit down and sketch out some ideas and brainstorm before we actually try to write out something official. I think once we sort of have an approach that we think might be reasonable, we should definitely write up a KEP, but I don't think we're at the point where anybody says like, this would be a great way to do it yet.
I'm wondering what the difference is between Minikube and a management cluster.
So Minikube goes away, right? Like if Minikube's running on my laptop, it can't be trusted to keep things running on the target cluster, right? So even if our workflow for clusterctl didn't delete Minikube at the end, which today it does, I shut my laptop or I disconnect from the network and I get on an airplane or whatever else, then all
Never
of a sudden,
go home. You're not allowed to leave.
yes. So yeah, I guess if you run that from like a VM in a managed instance group that like the cloud is keeping up for you or something, like maybe that would do it. But I think we can't rely on Minikube to be a management cluster, right? So we either need to be able to create a management cluster where we can then sort of apply the pattern that Locke was describing, or we need to have a way that we pivot and like stand up a cluster that's sort of self-maintainable going forward, which is what the code tries to do today using static pods with kubeadmin in it.
Yeah, and I would look at Minikube as like a first stab at something that's open, but every provider and infrastructure has their own specific mechanism for that can be leveraged to better create this central cluster.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. Like Minikube is convenient because it's portable. Everybody can run it, quote unquote everybody, right? Like you can run it in pretty much any environment. Obviously you can't necessarily run it on a VM in a cloud. Some places have security requirements that don't allow you to run VMs. So there are lots of restrictions on that sense. But in general, if someone just wants to show up to the project and pick something up, it's something that we can sort of trust that they'd be able to run Minikube, right?
Yeah, and it also requires users to install Minikube, the Docker machine drivers, and a hypervisor, and that's asking a lot.
It is, and I think where I was trying to go was, I guess, there are lots of Google also has a better way to, or a different way to run clusters, and just we have the Minikube implementation in OSS, which is different from the way we expect, like the way you could, if you had a management cluster on Google, you would run it on GKE, right? And if you had it on Amazon, you run it on EKS, and etc. And so I'm just thinking about whether we could make the OSS Minikube into a management cluster, so we didn't have this divide between the two, and what are those dependencies between. Like, when do we have to call back to the management cluster? When is Robbie allowed to close his laptop and go on holiday or go home? And when does he have to stay at work?
Well, there are also some who have experienced with skipping a bootstrap cluster and kind of building a binary that interacts with the actuators directly in order to stand up the initial cluster before deploying kind of the API server components that stood up cluster as well. So I think there are different ways to kind of accomplish that kind of bootstrapping step to where you can have that kind of quote unquote management cluster.
Yeah, and I think that, again, like Minikube is convenient because we know it's consistent across each of those environments. And I know like the way that the Gardener project has, I think it's called Kubify, to basically do exactly that, right? You can use Terraform or something like that to spin up your first set of things that allow you to start that process. And so yeah, I think, and that's goes back to Locke's from many meetings ago point of, we'd like to be able to experiment with different ways to do that, because Minikube's a great first start, but it isn't necessarily the experience that we want to give people 6 months from now or a year from now. So I think to circle back to your actual question, Jason, about HA control planes, I think we should, I don't know if the best way to start is to write up a doc. If we just want to, KubeCon's in a couple of weeks, if we just want to wait until KubeCon and try to find a room and a whiteboard and sit down and hash out some ideas. If we do that, we need to make sure that it's sort of not just like me and you sitting in a room, but like, we widely announce the people in this meeting so that people can try to show up if they're at KubeCon. And also understand that people aren't all going to be at KubeCon. So the result of that should be, here's a proposal. We know not everybody's there. You guys might have better ideas than we did. Please let us know what you think.
Yep, that sounds good to me.
Cool. So unfortunately, Andrew had to drop. I'm going to bump his thing up next, but he's not here. So it's about extending the machine status to add the provider ID and asking if there is any consensus on this issue. So it's number 565. So there's been quite a bit of back and forth. My reading of the issue is that most people agree that a provider ID is useful, if not for the original reasons in the PR, for different reasons. And the contention seems to be on whether it should be a spec or a status field, right? So I think to summarize, the arguments for status are that it, in most cases, appears to be an observed field. It's not something you can tell the cloud provider. It's something the cloud provider tells you. Therefore, it's sort of a status field. And the arguments for a spec field are, even though it's something that the cloud provider tells you, there are cases where you want to tell that field to the controllers because you know it a priori through some out-of-band means, and therefore it's something you want to provide, not you want to get back. And that would be the argument for spec.
The way spec and status was explained to me was that if it could be recovered, it can go into status, but if it can't be, it has to go into spec. So in other words, if you lost the status, could we get it back? And could we get the provider ID back? And I guess the answer in the general case would be no here. Right.
So I think, really, yeah, that seems like it's very provider dependent. So like in the AWS provider case, because we are tagging the instances that we're creating based on the cluster and the machine, we are able to recover that, but that is not necessarily the case for others. That said, I could see a use case where people would want to use pre-created resources, which means that they would have to be able to define that to pass it in advance.
In true Kubernetes fashion, when in doubt, annotation.
I mean, I guess one way to look for that is like, what exactly is that provider ID field is going to be used for? I mean, I think that, so for instance, if the actuator is going to depend upon that particular field being there to drive some sort of workflow, then I think, even if it might be discoverable or not, then it becomes crucial that it always is present, if it is a valid, if it is actually realized in the real world, then it has to be present at all times for the actuator to behave properly. if that is the case. So I think there were in the PR there were like a couple of different use cases, as you mentioned, Robert, that the original use case was slightly different than maybe how people want to use it. And I think that probably like what is the use case is probably more important in terms of whether it should belong in a spec or a field. That's my 2 cents. I mean, essentially, if a controller or actuator is dependent upon it, then I guess it probably belongs in the spec. But if it is not, that the behavior or the workflow is not dependent upon it, then it can definitely be in a status field, I think.
Well, I think the controllers are going to have to be a little bit flexible, because in most cases where you're not adopting existing infrastructure, the field's not going to be there, right? Like, so if I want the actuator to create a new machine, then this field would be missing or blank, which would tell the actuator, like, create something new for me. And if I want the actuator to adopt a machine, I might fill it in the spec, and the actuator says, oh, I can match that with something in the underlying provider and adopt that and make that, match this machine, right?
True, but adoption is not just the one use case. So I know kind of I brought that up earlier, that could be one way of kind of leveraging it. However, I mean, I'm just thinking of a simple use case where we are doing a bootstrap cluster and then we are pivoting onto it. I mean, that's like a simple workflow process that we have today. And in that simple use case, if, for example, if the assumption is that that provider ID will be utilized by the, let's say, the actuator or the controller in some shape or form to determine whether that exists or not exists or do something special about it, then if we put it in the status, then the moment we do the pivot, that field will be lost. And then the actuators will probably go on to a path to execute a code path that assumes that whatever the meaning or significance of that not being there is. And that's why I'm saying it's probably more important to kind of clearly articulate what exactly is the use case that we're trying to solve there with, with that particular provider ID field. And that can probably drive back the discussion of where it is better suited based on that.
Okay, Tim also puts in chat that he's not entirely kidding about using an annotation, since it varies between providers.
You can just look on object A or object B, or you can uniformly put it on object A and it doesn't even matter. That way it gets, the problem with putting a new field into an API is that you're expecting that it will be uniformly applied across all different providers. The beauty of an annotation is that you have kind of a dealer's choice between different providers, and you're not sort of saying strictly that this field is required to be used in this particular way across providers.
So it wasn't part of the kind of impetus of this for external tooling that's interacting with the cluster API objects? And that was kind of part of trying to standardize it across providers. If we go that annotation-based approach, I think it introduces the same issue that we have with having it in the provider config or provider status at this point.
It does. I'm not saying it won't. I think the problem is there is no one right answer for some of these things. And if people want to create auxiliary tools, they can do an either-or scenario. But that we can't necessarily put things into the core API if we can't come to consensus and agreement on where it should live.
Yeah, so the original reason for this PR was to put it in the API so the autoscaler could use it, right? So that would be generic tooling that relies upon this field to do something. And I think people pushed back on that, saying, well, we don't exactly know how the autoscaler is going to work integrating with cluster API. That's not a good reason to promote it. However, there are other reasons we would still want this field, right? And I think for those other reasons, Tim, you might be right that an annotation suffices for those other reasons. And then if we get to the point where the autoscaler does need it as a field that is consistently named and accessible, we can maybe move the annotations into a field at that point as part of those discussions. So I guess, to Siddharth or other folks that are wanting to use this field now, maybe Hardik, would an annotation suffice for now until we figure out the autoscaler integration, or do we believe there are other tools we want to build on top of the cluster API that need this field as a field right away?
Yes, so from my perspective, So provider IDs, first of all, I just mentioned once before. So but there are a couple of things. First of all, less important is user experience, where provider ID is something that's identifying a machine on the cloud provider, which I would definitely expect on my machine object, because if you are relying on any other mechanisms, which could be tags or private IPs and so on, there are still rare, but the possibilities of the misconfusions, right? So that was one reason. But then for us, what we do is that if you also think it over, provider ID is the most solid way of mapping the node with the machine, which can never go wrong. If you get the right provider ID on the machine object, then that's it. It cannot happen that you are mapping to the wrong machine on the cloud provider and the machine object is something else. But for the other ways, I have heard you could use the tags, you could use the private IPs, but we know that those are the reusable things. You can have same tags on two machines. I know no one will do that, but I'm just talking about the possibilities. And then for the private IPs also, the private IPs can be reused here and there if you have a sudden disruption with large cluster, and if some IP is being used here and there, you could have again confusion that some new machine get the IP which was allocated to some other machine object which was given previously, and things fail. But the provider ID is the only field which can very reliably solve the problem of mapping the node with the machine. So but now the question comes is that how, at the time of the bootstrapping itself, how do you basically decide that what would be the provider ID when you create the machine itself, right? So there are ways. So provider ID for different cloud providers have a very certain way of building it up. So you can actually check in the code of the Kubernetes where the format is very nicely defined. So for example, for AWS, the format is the region and slash the region, and then the slash the necessary zone, and then the instance ID. For Azure, it would be something slash subscription and the subscription ID. So this kind of details you would anyway have when you would try to create a machine. And the missing part would be that which cloud provider will be returning to you when you will make a create call. So, right. So for example, in AWS case, you would already know which region and zone you are trying to create. Plus, when you make a create call in return, you always get the instance ID back in your hand. So that could be the first layer. At the time of bootstrapping, you know what could be the right node, which is the right node, which should be mapped to the machine. And once the confirmation happens, that once you get the node object, you have anyway the full provider ID available in the node itself. So that is one way we can very reliably solve the problem of mapping node to the machine. And that is one of the reasons that I would like to see in the machine object as a field, but I don't have very strong opinions on having it on either status or spec. But, looking at the use cases, spec could be fine, but I have also seen the use cases where it was mentioned that if the machines are being deleted, and if you are implementing the machine controller the other way where the machine controller itself tries to recreate the machine, then you might want to update the provider ID in between, where again that falls into the philosophy that if you're updating something, that why don't you keep it in the machine status? So I don't have a strong opinion on where to keep it, but I do see this kind of use case for doing provider ID.
Thanks. Siddharth, did you have anything you wanted to add from your side?
Yeah, just one quick thing. So, I mean, I think I agree with the fact that, having that information present, available is good. I don't have any issues with that. Now, as far as the annotation is concerned, I think it's a reasonable, place, kind of in between place where you can at least put it. However, just a side note, I mean, what I've noticed is the clusterctl implementation that is in today makes certain assumptions about the annotations that will be there on the machines, which is kind of a little naive that we probably need to change. For example, I think if I remember correctly, what I saw in the code is when you create with using clusterctl, it is waiting for like list of annotations to show up, and the moment the annotation shows up, it thinks that the machine is ready, and it tries to move on, which essentially kind of broke for, let's say, for the example, the vSphere provider, because in the beginning when we were doing the reimplementation of the actuator, we tried to use the annotation to kind of keep track of some temporary data, like not exact temporary, like a task ID that's going on. And that kind of broke the clusterctl behavior, because the moment it saw the annotation present, it suddenly assumed that the machine or the underlying infrastructure is ready. So I mean, I think it's okay to put it in the annotation, but I guess we probably have to go back into the clusterctl and correct those assumptions as well. Just because otherwise we might see certain things not behave in the way we want it to be. That's the only thing. But otherwise, I'm okay with putting it annotation as well. I mean, I don't see any problems with that either.
I want to bring up, I think it was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I think there was a discussion about multi-provider, using multiple providers. Way back when we were talking about variants, I think we mentioned that ProviderID would be able to differentiate between different variants that created a machine or a cluster, or in that case, I'm just throwing it out there, having it in the spec instead of the annotation, making it common across all providers would make sense for that case, right? You want to know which provider actually created this machine or cluster.
I think that's a little bit different than what Hardik was saying, though, because what Hardik was saying was like the AWS, like inside of sort of, I guess it's in core Kubernetes right now, but in the cloud provider implementation, which we're extracting from core, there is a specific way that AWS creates a provider ID that we'd want to match.
Oh, I see.
So
Okay.
if you had two different variants that were both creating AWS VMs, you'd expect them to create the provider ID in the same format, right? Because they want to be parsable by that same sort of cloud provider library that understands how to parse provider IDs. Nate's asking in chat if it's offensive to use both an annotation and a status field. You could use the annotation sort of in place of the field in a spec. So you could use that sort of as a telling the actuator, the provider, to adopt or to take one that's being pivoted. And then you could use the status to actually post back the thing that's being observed. Which is definitely interesting. I think if we do use status as the end result, that might be a good way to work around Siddharth's concern, because you could even put the annotation on and then have the machine controller remove that annotation when it moves into the status. So it's kind of like a sort of transactional way to pass the data across. But I think we should probably first decide whether we want annotation or field. And if we want field, if we end up in status, this might be a way to pass the data into the status in one shot, because that was an objection with putting in the status, was you can't post the status initially. But I think that's a pretty cool idea. All right, are there any other thoughts on this one? Oh, go ahead, Locke.
I didn't say anything.
Oh, somebody was saying something. I saw your name pop up, so I thought it was you. Okay. I don't think we've quite reached consensus on this one. We only have 12 minutes left, and there are a number of other agenda items. So I think for now we'll need to move on. This has been actually really useful, and I think I'll try to go and summarize this discussion in the PR and see if that can help move the conversation forward and help us reach consensus here in the next week or two. Like the HA discussion, it might also be useful to sit down at KubeCon and have a high bandwidth discussion that can last longer than the 10 minutes or 15 minutes we get in this meeting every week. So Jason, you're asking about the current status of config and whether it'll be beta soon.
Yeah, this was more of an outstanding question. I know we have the alpha and the beta exit criteria set up, but that seems more for the actual cluster API implementation itself and less around the config objects that we're defining. And I know that there have been requests for graduating at least the machine spec or the machine config and the all of that. So I wanted to see thoughts from the group on how close do we think we are to going beta for at least the config objects.
When you say the config objects, you mean like the API definitions?
Well, yeah, the API structs that we're defining for the cluster machine in particular, but it would also be nice to settle on machine set and machine deployment as well.
Okay, so I guess I wouldn't call those config objects. I found that could be confusing. I wasn't sure what you're asking about. You're asking about like the machine API definition, the cluster API definition, machine set definition, the machine deployment definition, and
Right. Yep.
how close we think those are to being beta quality, which Tim had broken out into the next question about the status of making those things alpha, because we do have, there are a couple different milestones defined. We have a milestone for like how good is the implementation, but we also have a milestone for, let's see if I can find it real quick, for making the API alpha. I think we called it stable API. Maybe people are interpreting stable as different things, but I was thinking stable API, which has 5 open issues, was really the milestone of where we think the API is sort of good enough to start building on top of. And I would actually not call that beta, because the beta contract is pretty strong in terms of breaking compatibility. I would actually call that the first alpha, and use it for a little while and try to start building more things for real on top of it, and then sort of promote it to beta after we believe that it works and we shake out any issues with the API. So one of the things that had been on my list is to go back and sort of triage open issues and figure out if there's other things that should be in this milestone, which I hadn't gotten to yet. But I would love for us to be able to look at this milestone, and it is milestone /1, and be able to sort of pull that up at the beginning of this meeting every week and say, here are the things left before we think the API is settled. Like, can we knock those things out? Can we assign those issues to people? Can we finish that off, right? And actually use that to drive to this end state. So I think right now we're sort of weaving around based on things that people are interested in working on, things that happen to come up during conversation. And we're building lots of interesting and useful pieces, but we're not sort of driving consistently and coherently towards the state that you're asking about, right? Like, we'd love to get to the state where we believe the API is more stable, but we're not sort of intentionally moving ourselves in that direction. So I'd love to, I think Hardik and I were chatting about this offline in Slack the other day. I'd love to sort of more intentionally drive towards that state. Justin also mentioned this, I think, as part of the issue I linked below, the creating an alpha release, which Lucas was excited about last week, so that he could link to it from the kubeadmin GA blog post, and where we are there. And I think Justin had a great response to him there, which is we shouldn't rush or pretend that the cluster API is in a state that it's not. What we should really do is tell people that it's coming, point to people where we are now, but we should also maybe use that to light a fire under ourselves to try to get there faster.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So somebody stuck the milestone link into the notes. So if you have issues that you think should be in that milestone, I don't know how many people actually have access to change issues or set milestones. I don't know if the commands can do that, because as a repo owner, I can just set the labels directly. But I think if you type /milestone and put the milestone name, it should apply it. So I'd encourage everyone to sort of look through open issues, look through the API, and maybe create issues if they think there are other issues before we could say that we want to commit to this API going forward. Add them to that list. I will try to do the same thing, and maybe I'll put it at the top of the agenda for next week for us to review that list as a group. Try to get it to be the minimal set we agree on needs to be done before the API is stable, and then we can actually try to start burning that list down over the next couple of weeks.
I'm glad you brought up this milestone list, because I see on here create integration tests for machine controller, which I thought about asking that question this week, but maybe we'll talk about it next week. I don't want to. We don't have a lot of time, but we're thinking about that right now.
Yeah, so like I think you're looking at milestone 2, right, which Tim linked in the notes. I was actually talking about milestone 1. So there's one milestone that says basically what changes do we need to make to the API definitions for us to believe that they're done, and the other milestone, which is milestone 2, which is what do we have to do for us to be convinced that our implementation of that API is reasonable, right? And for the implementation part, we definitely want to have tests that are actually running in an automated sense. For the API definition itself, the things we have listed there are things like, there's one here about integration with the cluster registry, which is a question you brought up today. Like, what's our strategy for listing clusters? Is that something we want to build into our API? Is that something we defer to the cluster registry API? Figuring out errors. Most of these issues are pretty old because we haven't actually looked at this milestone in a while. There's one about changing the type of instance status. I have no idea what that's referring to, but it's basically things like, there were things on here about, kicking roles out of the top level as a top level field, because that's not something we want to support indefinitely going forward. So it's more things like, how do we tweak the API definitions to the point where they're stable, right? So as Jason was asking, like, when can we say that our API is stable and we can not have to worry about it changing underneath us as we build tools? And then the other milestone, which is milestone 2, is about how do we convince ourselves that our implementation of things like the machine deployment controller and the machine tech controller are working today and continue working as we submit PRs and make changes.
I'd also like to state that, like, perfect is the enemy of the good. And if we cut an alpha release, we can always cut another alpha release. That's kind of the beauty of alpha. My biggest concern is just making sure that we have API conversioning in place. So that way, if people do depend upon alpha 1, they get support for alpha 2 on the upgrade conversions, right? Right now, it's totally YOLO. So if you're kind of doing things, or if you've actually subsumed from upstream into your provider, you have no conversion apparatus that will be supported at this point in time, unless you're magically hit the right SHA, right? So I think that should also be a consideration. We don't need to wait forever to try and make sure we get all these issues assigned. We can say there's like a line that we say good enough, like, and we can always cut an alpha 2, alpha 3, alpha 4, however many alphas it gets to the point where we feel comfortable saying we're going to broadly support this push to a more stable version of the API.
So that's probably a great thing to put on that list, is API versioning support. And maybe that's the biggest blocker for us to saying everything else we can change, right? Like, once we have enough conversions in place where we think the chances of us actually breaking somebody where we can't forward convert them are pretty small, that might be enough for us to actually say that the API is ready for an alpha. Great. So that kind of covered 3 of the 4 remaining issues. They're all in one chunk. And the last one, in our last 3 minutes, Hardik has a link to the machine phases PR, which I don't know if everyone is here that was commenting on that. I don't see either of the people that LGTM'd at the end. But both Alvaro and let's see, who's the other person? Oh yes, Jason Murray, both LGTM'd it. I think they were the ones that had the largest number of questions about the PR. And I just wanted to bring it up one last time here before we merge it, because this is an API change, and make sure people didn't have objections before that goes in. So we have a couple of minutes if people have either last questions for Hardik or concerns or objections for the PR. Otherwise, we'll merge it after this meeting. It's I think most of you guys have been here for the last couple of weeks. We've discussed this PR sort of weekly for quite a while now. So hopefully there aren't too many more questions at this point that haven't been covered. Okay. While we wait, we'll give people a minute to think about it or to read it. In terms of scheduling, so there's next week's meeting, which is on December 5th. And the following week is during KubeCon. I'm going to go ahead and suggest that we cancel that meeting, because I think that most people here will probably be at KubeCon. And that we try to schedule some time for people to sit down and chat and get to know each other, maybe whiteboard a little bit about HA and some other things like that. If anybody wants to take the lead on trying to find a place and or time for us to get together, that would be awesome. And if not, we can chat about it again next week if people haven't started thinking about sort of a meeting time or place. I'll also remind people that we have a SIG cluster lifecycle intro talk that Tim and I are giving, which I believe is on Tuesday, and then a cluster API deep dive, which I believe is on Thursday. The deep dive is probably not, like the presentation is probably not going to be of interest to people here, because you guys actually are already going to know all the information that gets presented. But if people want to show up and meet people who aren't in this meeting normally that come and ask questions or help answer questions, that would be great. And it's also possible that maybe right after that, that talk slot would be a good time for us to get together and meet anyway. So I know that at the last KubeCon we did in Austin, we planned the sort of meeting time for SIG cluster lifecycle right after Lucas's talk, and that worked out pretty well because a lot of people who were interested in meeting were at Lucas's talk, and we kind of corral people out the door and say, hey, if you're interested in learning more, just come with us. We're going to have a little get together right after this. So that's something people should start thinking about because that's coming up here pretty quick. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Siddharth.
So on the KubeCon, are you guys going to do some sort of a get together? We're going to hash out some proposals. Is it possible for you guys to also have like a Zoom session in there? I mean, I'm still kind of on wait list, so I'm not sure if I'm going to make it there, but I would love to be part of it. So if there's a Zoom session, that will help.
Yes, we can certainly try to do that. Sometimes that doesn't work real well with whiteboarding if we start talking about, drawing pictures on the board and so forth. And also the other caveat there is sometimes there's not like a room where you can have it sort of quiet enough with background noise for people remotely to be able to hear. But if you know that you're not going to be there, or if other people know they're not going to be there, and it would be helpful for us to be able to sort of live stream that, then yes, we'll do what we can. I've certainly missed these in the past. There was a get together in the KubeCon Europe last time that I wasn't at. But yes, if people know they aren't going to be there and are interested, we will do what we can to try and make it accessible to remote people.
Or at least
Or
at least just do a Zoom session and then just record it and then just say, hey guys, here's the link.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, it's 11. I haven't heard any objections in chat or verbally about the machine phases PR, so I'm gonna go ahead and approve that and let it merge. Please, everyone, go back and update issues if there are things you want to comment on. And if not, we will see everyone again next week. Thanks for coming.